The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. The historical events discussed are based on documented records, scholarly research, and primary sources. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of the events portrayed. Listener discretion is advised for discussions of death, mass suffering, and psychological trauma. Okay, before I get into anything, and before I even tell you what today's episode is about, I need you to do something for me. I need you to picture something. It's July, it's 1518, and you live in Strasbourg. At this point in history, that city has been battered by famine, plague, and I mean literally plagued by disease, crushed under the weight of serfdom, feudal taxation, and the creeping, suffocating dread that comes from not knowing whether God is punishing you or has simply forgotten you exist. The Holy Roman Empire is crumbling in slow motion, and the Black Death has already swept through multiple times like it has a subscription service. People are dying of starvation in the streets, and the rivers run cold and gray and indifferent. You are exhausted in your bones. You are hungry. You are afraid, and you haven't laughed in what feels like years. Your neighbors have died. Your children might die. You might die. You pray every single day, and you're not sure that anyone is listening. And then one woman walks out into the street, and she starts to dance. But then she doesn't stop. She dances through the night. She dances the next day. She dances until her feet bleed. She dances until her shoes fall apart. She dances until she can barely breathe. She dances until people start staring. And then, because this is humanity, and humanity is profoundly and terrifyingly weird, other people start to dance with her. And within a week, dozens of people are dancing. Within a month, somewhere between 50 to 400 people are dancing in the streets of Strasbourg through the heat of the summer until their feet are destroyed, until their hearts are giving out, and until some of them simply die. And nobody can stop them. Welcome to the Velvet Guillotine. I'm your host, April Ford, and today we're talking about the dancing plague of 1518. One of the most genuinely bewildering, heartbreaking, and psychologically terrifying events in recorded human history. An event that most people have never even heard of. An event that, the longer you sit with it, the more it stops being a quirky historical footnote and starts being a mirror, and a very dark one. So let's go. To understand the dancing plague, you have to understand Strasbourg in 1518. Because what happened there didn't come out of nowhere. It never does. And the scariest things in history never come out of nowhere. They come out of pressure. They come out of a world that has been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until something or someone cracks. Strasbourg in the early 16th century was a city on the edge. Europe, as a whole, had spent the last century and a half in a kind of perpetual catastrophe. The Black Death had killed somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-1300s. Let that just sit with you for a second. 30 to 60%? If you applied those numbers to the United States today, we'd be talking about 100 to 200 million people dead in about 4 years. Your entire extended family, gone. Your neighborhood, gone. Your priest, your doctor, your lawyer, your baker, your neighbors, all of them, gone. And rotting in mass graves dug in the middle of the night because there weren't enough living people to dig individual ones. And the plague didn't just leave and stay gone. It came back again and again and again. like a toxic ex who keeps showing up at your door. Outbreaks swept through Europe in 1360, 1374, 1400, 1438, 1456, and 1464. And I could keep going. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were living generationally in the aftermath of catastrophe layered on catastrophe. And they didn't just fear death, they had grown up with it like it was their next door neighbor. So by 1518 specifically, the situation in the Rhine Valley, which is the region where Strasbourg sits, had reached a particularly brutal point. Multiple consecutive years of crop failure had led to widespread famine, and syphilis, a disease that had swept into Europe from the Americas around 1493, was spreading rapidly. And there was no understanding of it, no treatment, and an enormous amount of terror around it. Because at that time, it was new. It was mysterious. It killed slowly and horribly, and it marked you in ways that were impossible to hide. And then there was the social structure. The people standing in the streets of Strasbourg in 1518 were not nobles. They weren't wealthy merchants. They were, by and large, peasants, serfs, people who had essentially no control over their own lives and who worked land they did not own, who paid taxes and tithes to masters they feared. These people were trapped, legally, economically, physically trapped in a system that offered no exit and no relief. And this is important. I want you to hold on to this because when we talk about what happened in Strasbourg, we cannot talk about it as though it happened in a vacuum. We cannot talk about it as though it was simply a weird medieval thing that occurred because people back then were superstitious and they were irrational. The people of Strasbourg were not stupid. They were not uniquely irrational. They were people, fully human people who had been subjected to conditions of chronic, unrelenting, multi-generational trauma, poverty, fear, and powerlessness. And their bodies and minds did what human bodies and minds do under those conditions. They broke, just not in the way that you might expect. Her name was Frau Troffea. That's all we know her by. Frau Troffea. The Frau is simply a German honorific, Mrs., essentially. Her first name has been lost to history, which feels both tragic and fitting given what she was about to set in motion. And on a day in mid-July 1518, the exact date is disputed, but most historians place it between the 14th and the 16th of July, Frau Troffea walked out of her house on a narrow street in Strasbourg and began to dance. She didn't appear to be celebrating anything. She wasn't performing. There was no music. There was no festival. It was, by all accounts, a spontaneous, involuntary, seeming convulsive movement. Her body simply began to move, and it did not stop. She danced through the afternoon. She danced as the sun went down. She danced through the night. And by morning, she was still going. People had begun to gather and watch, unsure of what they were seeing. And over the next 4 to 6 days, accounts differ, Frau Troffea danced essentially without stopping. She may have collapsed periodically from exhaustion, only to rise and continue. Witnesses noted that she appeared to be in like a trance-like state. She didn't seem entirely present at all. Her eyes were open but very unfocused, and she did not respond normally when people tried to approach her. After roughly a week of this, the city authorities had her transported to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne, about 30 kilometers away. St. Vitus was the patron saint of dancers, and coincidentally, the patron saint of those suffering from certain neurological disorders. including what we now call Sydenham's chorea, a condition that caused involuntary movements and was historically known as St. Vitus's dance. The implication was clear. The authorities believed, or at least they hoped, that Frau Troffea was suffering from a spiritual affliction, one that could be cured by pilgrimage and prayer, or by the intervention of the appropriate saint. We don't know if the cure worked for Frau Troffea. We know it didn't work for what came next, though, because by the time she was removed from the streets of Strasbourg, other people had already started dancing. Within a week of Frau Troffea's initial episode, roughly 34 other people had joined her in the streets to dance. By August, which is roughly about a month from the first incident, contemporary accounts suggest that somewhere between 50 and 400 people were dancing simultaneously in Strasbourg. The range in those numbers reflects the chaos of the historical record and the difficulty of counting people who are perpetually in motion across a city. But even the conservative estimates are pretty staggering. These were not people who wanted to dance. That is crucial to understand. These dancers were not joyful, and they did not do it because they wanted to. They were not celebrating. By all contemporary accounts, and we have quite a few, because this event was documented by city authorities, by physicians, and by chroniclers, these dancers were suffering. They were in pain. Many were weeping as they moved. Some were screaming. Their feet became so raw and bloodied that the streets were reportedly marked with blood where they'd been. And they could not stop. Contemporary physician Dr. Paracelsus, one of the most significant medical figures of the modern period, documented the plague, as did the Strasbourg City Council in their official records. The Strasbourg Chronicle of Sebastian Brent, written in the same period, references the event. We have guild records, we have ecclesiastical records. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. This happened. And people at the time were desperate enough to document it because they had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The city authorities tried everything. First, they tried the obvious. They cleared the dancers away, moved them off the streets. That didn't work. The dancers continued dancing wherever they put them. And then, in what can only be described as a decision that made things significantly worse, the Strasbourg City Council did something that, from a 21st century perspective, is absolutely mind-blowing. They decided that the dancing was a natural illness, not a moral failing, not a demonic possession, a natural physical illness. And the prescribed cure for this illness? More dancing. I want you to sit with that for a second. The people in charge literally looked at hundreds of their citizens dancing themselves to literal death and said, you know what they need? A stage, music, professionals. The city council hired musicians, fiddlers, pipers, drummers. They converted their guild halls and outdoor spaces into official dancing venues. They brought in professional dancers, men whose job it was to literally dance for a living, to join the afflicted and keep them moving. On the theory that the illness had to run its course, and that by keeping the blood circulating would prevent the afflicted from dying from stasis. That's the medieval equivalent of the government seeing a mass overdose event and responding by setting up comfortable lounges with better drugs. It is from every angle a catastrophic misread of the situation. And predictably, it made things much, much worse. The music attracted more people, and the dancing spread, and people began to die of heart attacks, of strokes, of dehydration and exhaustion, and of feet so destroyed they could no longer support the weight of their own body. Contemporary accounts suggest that during the height of the plague, in the brutal heat of August of 1518, as many as 15 people a day were dying from dancing. 15 a day. The city was watching its citizens literally dance themselves to death, and for a period of weeks, they could not stop it. When the city's secular response failed, spectacularly, I might add, they turned to the church. The church's diagnosis was what you would expect: sin, specifically divine punishment for the city's moral failings. The clergy decided that the dancing was a curse, God's wrath made manifest in the body of the afflicted. The prescribed treatment shifted from dancing stages to pilgrimage, prayer, fasting, and religious intercession. The Bishop of Strasbourg supported the removal of the musicians. City authorities banned the dancing stages. The afflicted were marched, sometimes carried, sometimes dragged, to shrines and churches, particularly the shrine of St. Vitus. And here is where the historical record gets genuinely interesting. Because by September 1518, roughly 2 months after Frau Troffea first danced into the street, the plague appears to have ended. The dancing stopped, and people returned to their homes. The crisis passed. Now, you may be thinking, okay, so the prayer worked. The pilgrimage worked. Maybe. Or maybe not. Because here's what we know about mass psychogenic illness, which is, as we'll get into in the next section, the most widely accepted modern explanation for what happened in Strasbourg. It is that it tends to end when the conditions that created it change, when the social pressure is released, when the community is given a framework, any framework, for understanding and containing what happened. The church gave the people of Strasbourg a story, a container, a reason. The dancers were being punished. They could be saved. There was an authority who understood what was happening and was taking steps to address it. The randomness and the terror of the situation was replaced with narrative. And narrative, it turns out, is the most powerful medicine human beings have ever invented. Okay, so let me talk about what we think actually happened in Strasbourg in 1518. The term mass hysteria gets thrown around a lot in popular culture, usually in a very dismissive way. It conjures images of hysterical women in Victorian novels or teenagers having collective meltdowns at slumber parties. It's often used to delegitimize experiences, to imply that nothing real happened, and that people simply made things up or got too carried away. I want to be very clear about something. This is not what mass psychogenic illness is. That is not what we are talking about here. Mass psychogenic illness, the preferred clinical term, is a genuine, documented medical phenomenon in which groups of people develop real physical symptoms in response to shared psychological stress. The symptoms are real. The suffering is real. The physical manifestations, the convulsing, the paralysis, blindness, the inability to stop moving, are all very real. And they are produced by a brain and body in response to conditions of extreme psychological pressure. They are not consciously chosen actions. They are not fake, and they are not performances. The brain is fundamentally the body's operating system. And like any other operating system, when it is subject to conditions far outside of its normal parameters for far too long, it can crash or it can glitch. It can generate outputs that seem to have nothing to do with the inputs, or that are, in a terrible way, perfectly logical responses to inputs that the conscious mind has been unable to process. Dr. John Waller, a historian of medicine at Michigan State University, who has written extensively on the dancing plague, argues that the event in Strasbourg was almost certainly a case of mass psychogenic illness triggered by the extreme social, economic, and spiritual distress of the time. The people of Strasbourg were living under conditions that created, in his analysis, a perfect storm for this kind of collective psychological event. The mechanism, as best as modern researchers can reconstruct it, likely worked something like this. Frau Troffea, already under an enormous amount of psychological stress, possibly exacerbated by personal circumstances we will never know, or possibly related to a specific triggering event, or possibly simply the circumstances of years of accumulated trauma, she had a dissociative episode. Her body began to move involuntarily, a manifestation of psychological distress that the medical literature has documented across cultures and centuries. It is not unique to Europe. It's not unique to medieval times. It happens even today. What made Strasbourg unique was what happened next, because the people watching Frau Troffea were also under enormous psychological stress, and they shared deeply a cultural framework in which involuntary dancing was meaningful. St. Vitus's dance was a known, feared, culturally recognized affliction. And the moment that other people watched Frau Troffea and thought consciously or unconsciously that could happen to me, the mechanism was put in place for the illness to spread. And this is not weakness. This is not stupidity. This is how human neurology works. The human brain is, among other things, a profoundly social organ. We are wired for social contagion. We yawn when other people yawn. We feel anxious in crowds that are anxious. We laugh more easily when other people are laughing. We're built to read and mirror emotional and psychological states of those around us. This is a feature, not a bug. It's the neurological basis of empathy, of community, of culture. But under circumstances of extreme stress, the same mirroring capacity can produce something very, very dark. It can produce a room full of people who can't stop dancing. Okay, so here is the part that I think genuinely broke something in my brain when I first researched this. 1518 was not the first time that this happened. There were documented cases of mass dancing afflictions going back to at least the 14th century in Europe. The most notable historical precursor to 1518 occurred in 1374, when in the aftermath of a particularly devastating wave of the bubonic plague, thousands of people in the cities of Aachen, Cologne, Metz, Strasbourg, and other Rhine Valley cities began dancing in the streets in a manner very similar to what would happen 144 years later. Chroniclers at the time described the dancers as being in a trance-like state, crying out for help, unable to stop themselves, seeing visions of demons and saints, and dying from the physical exertion. The dancing spread along trade routes and river valleys, following, interestingly enough, the same path that the news and the people traveled. There were also similar documented outbreaks throughout the intervening century and a half. In 1418, in 1428, and in the 1460s. The 1518 outbreak in Strasbourg was the largest and best documented, but it was not an isolated anomaly. It was the culmination of a recurring pattern. And that pattern, when you look at it through the lens of what we know about mass psychogenic illness, makes a very specific kind of sense. Every major outbreak of dancing plague in the historical record occurred in the Rhine Valley, in communities that shared specific cultural and religious frameworks. every major outbreak occurred in the immediate aftermath of or during periods of extreme social crisis. Plagues, famine, political upheaval. Every major outbreak involved people from the lower social strata as well, peasants, serfs, and the poor, rather than people from upper classes. And every major outbreak eventually ended, not through medical intervention, because there was no effective medical intervention at the time, but through changes in the social environment around the dancers, the afflicted. The geographic clustering is very significant, and it suggests not just shared stress, but shared cultural templates. The people of the Rhine Valley shared specific religious traditions, specific fears about St. Vitus, and divine punishment, specific stories about what dancing affliction looked like. And when the affliction began to spread, it spread along lines of shared culture and shared terror. It inhabited an existing template in their communal imagination. So, in other words, the specific form that the breakdown took was culturally determined. The people of 1518 Strasbourg didn't break into catatonic stillness or mass visions or violent aggression. They danced, because dancing, involuntary, uncontrolled dancing, was the culturally available form that psychological catastrophe took in their world at that time. Okay, I want to stay here for just a minute in this idea because I think it's the most important one. Every culture has its own available forms of mass psychological breakdown. These forms shift over time, but they are always shaped by fears, beliefs, narratives, and social structures of the moments. In the 19th century, upper-class women in America and Europe experienced epidemic hysteria, convulsions, paralysis, fainting, emotional volatility, at rates that later medical historians recognized as psychogenic responses to lives of profound confinement and powerlessness. The form the breakdown took, the Victorian hysterical women, that was culturally determined. It was the available template. In the 1950s, American schools periodically experienced what they called mystery illnesses. Groups of students who would develop nausea, fainting, and physical symptoms that had no identifiable physical causes. These were mass psychogenic illness events. They tended to cluster in schools and communities under specific kinds of social stress, and they followed patterns of social contagion rather than patterns of physical infection. In 2011, a group of girls in Leroy, New York, began developing Tourette's-like tics, twitching, and involuntary movements. 18 girls were eventually affected. Medical investigations found no physical cause. The diagnosis was mass psychogenic illness. The girls' symptoms were real. Their suffering was real. And it spread, those researchers believe, through a combination of social contagion and shared stress. The girls knew each other, or knew of each other, and the template of the illness passed between them. And then, I want to be careful here, because this is the part where we have to be honest about something very, very uncomfortable. We look at the people of 1518 Strasbourg and we see them clearly. People who are under impossible pressure in a world that offered them no exit, their minds and bodies generating a crisis that their community had no framework to understand or address. And we see their humanity and we feel compassion for them. So the question is, do we extend that same compassion to ourselves? Because the conditions that produce the dancing plague, like chronic helplessness, systematic inequality, institutional failure, collective trauma, and the desperate need for meaning in the face of an indifferent universe. Those conditions didn't end in 1518, and they didn't end in the 14th century. They're not foreign to us. The forms change, the templates shift, but the human need that underlies them, the need to escape unbearable pressure, to have the body say what the mind cannot, to be seen and named and placed inside a story that gives all the suffering meaning, that need, that's not historical. It's not safely contained in the past. The Dancing Plague is not a story about ignorant medieval peasants doing some weird stuff. It's a story about what happens to human beings when the world they live in becomes genuinely unlivable and nobody in power acknowledges it. It is a story about what the body does when the mind has nowhere left to go. There is a version of the Dancing Plague story that circulates in popular culture, and I want to take a few minutes to address it because it really gets the story fundamentally wrong. The popular version goes something like this. Crazy medieval people thought they had to dance for religious reasons, so they danced until they died. The end. Wasn't medieval Europe wild? That version does several things. It flattens the historical reality, it removes the suffering, and it turns the victims of a genuine mass psychological crisis into a curiosity, a footnote in the Museum of Historical Weirdness, like cod pieces or wigs or bear baiting. It it lets us look at what happened from a comfortable distance, shake our heads, and return to our lives without any of the discomfort that comes from recognizing ourselves in the story. It also completely elides the role of social power in the event. Because here's something worth noting. The Dancing Plague did not affect the nobles of Strasbourg. It did not affect the wealthy merchants, the city councilors, the bishops, the men who made decisions on how the city would respond. It didn't affect any of them. It affected the poor. It affected serfs and laborers and people on the absolute bottom of a brutal social hierarchy. The people who were dancing themselves to death in the streets of Strasbourg in 1518 were the same people who were dying of famine, dying of plagues, dying of poverty, with no political voice, no social mobility, no recourse, and no safety net. The people who were making decisions about how to respond, like with the musicians and the guild halls and the eventual religious intervention, those were the people who had power, who had options. And those people could leave if they needed to. The plague was both democratic in its mechanism. The mass psychogenic illness doesn't require a specific social class, by the way, and deeply undemographic in its undemocratic in its distribution, because the conditions that produced it were the conditions of social oppression, and the bodies that broke were the bodies that had been subjected to those conditions most completely. That is not an accident. That is the story. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is the last major recorded outbreak of mass dancing illness in European history. After September of that year, that specific form of mass psychogenic illness that had appeared periodically in the Rhine Valley for over a century essentially vanished. Historians have proposed several reasons for this. One is that the Protestant Reformation, which formally began in 1517, a year before the Dancing Plague, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. The Reformation fundamentally disrupted the Catholic cultural framework that had given the Dancing Plague its specific shape. St. Vitus's dance, the fear of divine punishment, the specific religious template that gave the illness its form, these were products of specific Catholic cosmology that the Reformation began to dismantle. Without the template, the specific form of the illness had nothing to inhabit. Another reason, much less discussed, is that the social conditions in the Rhine Valley, while they certainly didn't improve dramatically in the late 16th century, did shift in some very specific ways. The consolidation of political authority in some regions, small improvements in agricultural technique, the gradual, and I mean very gradual, development of new economic structures. All of these factors may have slightly reduced the particular pressure cooker like conditions that made the Rhine Valley a repeated epicenter of mass psychogenic illness. Or maybe it just changed forms. Maybe the way human beings in that part of the world expressed collective psychological crisis shifted, like to religious wars or to witch trials that would sweep through that same Rhine Valley community in the late 16th and 17th centuries, burning tens of thousands of people that were accused of sorcery. Because the conditions that originally caused all of this didn't end. The need didn't end. The pressure, none of that ended. It just found new templates. I want to come back to Frau Troffea. We know so little about her. I mean, we know her surname, and we know that she lived on a specific street in Strasbourg. Some accounts suggest that her husband was still alive when the dancing began, and that he was frantic with worry and helplessness. Some accounts suggest he sought assistance from city authorities, which is how the event became to be so officially documented in the first place. And we know that she danced for roughly about a week, maybe longer. And we know that she was removed from Strasbourg and taken to a shrine. We don't know if she recovered. We don't know if she ever danced again, voluntarily or otherwise. We don't know if she lived out her natural life or if she died young, and as so many people in that time and place did. We don't know what her life looked like before July of 1518, or what she thought about during those days and nights when her body moved without her permission. We don't know what she was running from. We don't know what she was trying to say. And that, honestly, is the most heartbreaking part of this story. Because something happened to her, something inside her, some accumulation of grief or terror or exhaustion or despair, that something inside of her just cracked and her body started moving and it couldn't stop. And then within days, she was joined by dozens of people who knew exactly how she felt, even if none of them could have told you why. She started something. She didn't mean to. She was simply the first one who broke. And in a world that offered her no language for what was happening, no diagnosis, no therapy, no political framework, no social safety net, no institutional acknowledgement that the conditions of her life were themselves a form of violence, her body spoke the only way it could. It danced. I have thought about her a lot since I started researching this episode, and I've thought about the specific quality of her suffering, the way it moved through her, the way it just radiated outward, and the way that it resonated out in hundreds of other bodies that were vibrating at the same exact frequency of desperation. I've thought about the fact that we remember this event some 500 years later, precisely because of what she did, and that we don't even know her name. We know what she did. We know the shape of her breaking. We just don't know who she was. And that feels like something worth sitting with. There is a concept in psychology called somatization, the process by which psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms. The word comes from the Greek soma, meaning body, And it is in some ways the most human thing imaginable. The body becoming the text on which the mind writes that which it cannot otherwise express. And the dancing plague of 1518 was, among other things, an act of mass somatization. 500 years before we had the vocabulary to name what was happening, the bodies of Strasbourg were writing something. They were writing, "We are suffering." They were writing, "We cannot continue." They were writing, "The world as it is not survivable for us." And so what the city authorities heard is, these people need a dance floor and some musicians. And what the church heard was, these people have sinned and they require pilgrimage. Neither of them heard what was actually being said. And I think about that a lot. About the gap between what suffering looks like from the outside and what it feels like from the inside. About the way institutions respond to mass human distress. In this instance, the dance floors, the prayer, the removal, and the containment, without ever addressing what caused the distress in the first place. About the way we look at the past and we shake our heads at how little they understood without asking ourselves what we're missing now. Because there are always people dancing in the streets. The templates change. The sufferers change. The specific shape of the breaking changes. But the question underneath all of it is always the same. Is anyone actually listening? This has been The Velvet Guillotine with April Rain. If this episode moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, good. That's the point. If you want to dive deeper into the dancing plague of 1518, I really recommend John Waller's A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, the extraordinary story of the dancing plague of 1518. It's one of the most humane and rigorous treatments of the subject I've encountered. And Waller writes with the kind of empathy for historical suffering that I think this story really demands. The past is not safe. History is not comfortable. And the people who lived it were no less than us. They were exactly us. So until next time, stay dark out there.